Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is part 3 of module 3 on epistemology, or the study of knowledge. At the end of part 2, we find the Cartesian theater transformed but intact. The external world has shattered into the arbitrary, disconnected tiles of the Humean mosaic. To create sense out of this chaos, the Kantian transcendental self projects cause, sequence, and order onto phenomenal experience. But the world beyond our mental categories becomes incomprehensible, alien, and unknowable. Part of the point of this story is to show how optional each one of these steps was. If Descartes had been more outgoing and spent less time in his armchair, we might have an entirely different common sense understanding of what sort of thing a mind is now. To give an example, Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr had a famous disagreement about quantum physics. Bohr suggested that fundamental particles don't have definite locations in space-time independent of experimental observations. Einstein found this appalling. Common sense dictates that for something to be real, it has to have properties that exist independently, whether or not you're observing them. But the common sense he's appealing to here is actually the Humean mosaic, with its scattering of self-contained events that are complete in themselves and radically disconnected from one another. The entanglement of observer and observed is incomprehensible from the standpoint of the mosaic. Even where the conclusions might seem dubious, the methodologies have survived. Consider Descartes' method of placing entire classes of beliefs under a logical microscope to search out the tiniest flaws that might undermine the whole. We can see this method at work in the way that Edmund Gettier demolishes justified true belief, and with it, the dream of Enlightenment certainty. By exposing a tiny loophole, seemingly trivial in itself, Gettier brings down 2,000 years of philosophical consensus about justification. Gettier cases come in many forms. One of the more intuitive versions is the case of the sheep in the field. Imagine you are standing outside of a field. Off in the distance, you see what looks very much like a sheep standing in the field. A belief forms naturally in your mind that there is a sheep in that field. And there is actually a sheep in the field. But it's hidden just out of your line of sight. It's behind a hill. What you're looking at is a dog that has been dressed in a sheep costume. So it turns out that your belief is true. There really is a sheep in the field. And your belief is justified. Any rational observer who sees the dog in sheep's clothing would come to the same conclusion. But what you don't seem to have is actual knowledge. The fact that your belief is true has nothing to do with the justification. It's just a happy accident that a sheep happens to be elsewhere in the field. What this demonstrates is that you can have impeccable reasons for believing that something is true, and yet still fall short of knowing it. Possessing justified true belief, it turns out, does not qualify as a sufficient condition for establishing knowledge. Something else is needed. And this lecture brings us to the present quest in epistemology, brings us up to date, to figure out what that something else is. This will be a whirlwind tour of epistemological theories. There's a lot of material to cover, so please consult the handout for details. Robert Nozick suggests that the missing ingredient is what he calls sensitivity to truth. A belief is sensitive to truth to the extent that if the world were different, our belief would be different. If there were no sheep in the field, nothing hidden behind the hill, would you still believe that there was a sheep in the field? Nozick's answer is yes. The disguised dog would still lead you to the same belief. Changing the world doesn't change the belief. Therefore, the belief is not what he calls truth tracking. It's not sensitive to actual facts about the world. Or maybe the problem is the assumption that justification must map on to some sort of foundational certainty in the world itself. This assumption, which is shared by both rationalists and empiricists, is known as foundationalism. An alternative view might suggest that a belief is justified not by its foundations, but by its coherence with other beliefs. Coherentist theories of justification argue that a belief is justified to the extent that it fits or fails to fit within a wider network of mutually supporting beliefs. If we prefer our truth to be based in solid foundations, then Nozick's sensitivity criteria is pretty appealing. But foundationalism presumes that the split between the Cartesian theater and the external world is valid, right? Translating the problem into the language of truth tracking doesn't offer an obvious strategy for predicting whether our internal beliefs will be sensitive to facts in the external world. Susan Hack leverages the strengths of both foundationalism and coherentism in a view that she calls foundherentism, by combining the words. Consider the puzzle of justification through the metaphor of a crossword puzzle. Hack asks us, to complete a crossword, you start with the evidence of the crossword clue. That's your foundation. But the correct answer also has to fit in with the intersecting network of crossword rows and columns. Hack argues that justification is like this, that it works in a similar way. A belief is justified to the extent that it is both grounded in good evidence and that it is accepted as coherent rather than rejected as incoherent by the web of existing epistemic scaffolding. But it isn't clear that adding a coherence criteria adequately addresses our concerns here about foundationalism. Miasma theory, if you remember from Semmelweis, miasma theory appeared to be a coherent network of beliefs for the medical community of Semmelweis's time, but we now understand that theory to have been false. The crossword puzzle appears to have selected the wrong answer in that case. Linda Zagzebski, her form of virtue epistemology, shifts the conversation into a more practical register by identifying conscientiousness as the missing component to knowledge. We can read the Semmelweis case through Zagzebski's account of the myth of Cassandra. Like Cassandra, Semmelweis was doomed to possess life-saving knowledge and yet unable to convince others of its truth. Because Semmelweis was conscientious, because he cared about the truth, he was isolated from his epistemic community, unable to translate his knowledge across an incommensurable paradigm. This misalignment between the epistemic obligations of Semmelweis and those of the authorities of his time eventually cost him his freedom and his life. Virtue epistemology moves us away from the foundationalist and coherentist frameworks and shifts our focus onto the practical obligations that caring about the truth imposes upon conscientious subjects. The recognition that affect and emotion play a role in our relationship to knowledge seems to wear away a bit at the walls of the Cartesian theater. Care and obligations seem to possess an embodied concreteness that talk of foundations in either reason or experience lacks. And this account also underscores the importance of power in epistemic relationships. Michel Foucault coined the term power knowledge to emphasize the ways in which what shows up as knowledge is a function of who controls the power of knowledge production. With Kant, the mind becomes a constructor of reality, rather than simply a passive observer. But it seems that the world that is constructed is always constructed by some interest and according to some purpose. As Karani pointed out in Module 2, even the objectivity of science is ultimately undermined by the biases of the institutions and donors who exert power by choosing which experiments to fund. And in the Semmelweis case, the power of the medical establishment was made concrete within the crossword puzzle formed by the intersection of miasma theory and class privilege, a conceptual scheme within which his evidence registered as unintelligible noise and madness. Narayan further complicates this picture by translating the work of W.E.B. Du Bois through the lens of standpoint epistemology. To survive as a marginalized group within a dominant culture, requires a sort of conceptual double vision, according to Narayan. One has to understand both the epistemic landscape of one's own culture and the epistemic landscape of the dominant culture at the same time. The dominant group, meanwhile, faces no similar pressure to learn how to navigate the world from the marginalized perspective. This creates an asymmetry of knowledge that's different from the one that Foucault identifies. Oppressed groups are forced to possess more knowledge than privileged groups. The 19th century medical establishment had no incentives to understand the point of view of Semmelweis. Minimum wage workers understand realities of poverty that remain effectively invisible to the wealthy. Power manifests paradoxically as the luxury to remain ignorant about the suffering of others. Now, standpoint theory fully situates knowledge within the fluid dynamics and negotiations of social position and power. Power may influence the production of knowledge, but the knowledge that it produces is necessarily impoverished because it excludes the perspective of other knowers. The walls of the theater close in as our obligations to truth recede. Escaping the theater only shows up as a live possibility for those who don't benefit from being inside. And that is perhaps the crucial point. The modern conception of knowledge was constructed by specific individuals from specific cultures with specific tools over the course of centuries. The Cartesian theater and the Humean mosaic were constructed within the Western philosophical tradition to address specific, historically contingent questions about the foundations of knowledge. Descartes divided the mind from the world. Locke projected the world inside of the mind. Hume extracted all meaning and connection from the representation. And Kant made the Western mind itself the subject and object of its own investigation. In his reply to Bertrand Russell, D.Z. Phillips suggests one possible alternative to this picture. We can avoid the theater entirely by choosing not to build it in the first place. Prior to Descartes, the mind was always already world-involving. There was no rupture to heal, no outside to reconcile with an inside. It was understood that what we perceived was not an image or a representation, but things in the world. This view is sometimes known as direct realism. Consider Russell's bent stick once again. If we abandon the notion that there is some veil of sense data standing between us as internal spectators and the world as an external object of correspondence, then there is no mystery about the stick to solve, right? Under favorable, what Phillips calls favorable perceptual circumstances, the stick would appear just as scientific instruments describe it, straight. But partial submersion in water creates unfavorable circumstances for perception. And we understand this, right? Because we know that water refracts light. It distorts straight lines. We understand how that works. A stick appearing bent in water isn't mysterious. It's exactly how we'd expect it to appear given our understanding of the mechanics of water, light, and visual perception. The stick looks bent in water because perception involves an entire world, not individual atoms of sense data. There are no representations and no inner theater for them to inhabit. There are only humans engaging with a world. And maybe knowledge is better off understood as a practice, as a way of engaging more or less skillfully with that world. So, does recasting knowledge as situated and perspectival abandon the search for truth altogether? Only if we assume that knowledge requires the transcending of all perspectives. But there is no truly objective view from nowhere. Knowledge is inextricably embodied, embedded, and situated within complex social matrices. The supposedly universal subject dissolves into a multitude of situated knowers whose collective perspectives offer a conceptually richer world picture. Questions of knowledge are always already questions of power, identity, and justice. Epistemology is thus necessarily a political project. When we abandon the myth of the disconnected universal knower, we realize that knowledge doesn't represent the world, it participates in its creation. We are all, always already, engaged in the collective construction of reality. We can choose to reproduce the narratives that we are given, or we can choose to confront, with open eyes, the question of what sort of world we ought to create. So perhaps the role of philosophy isn't to escape the Cartesian theater, but instead to burn it to the ground. And I think that's a good place to end. We will pick up next time with Module 4 on the metaphysics of mind. See you there.